So good afternoon, everyone. We're extremely thrilled to welcome Jon Meacham back to Google for his encore appearance. We had him previously for his Pulitzer Prize winning book, American Lion, the biography of Andrew Jackson. And today he returns to us going further back in the pages of time to his new work on Thomas Jefferson. Jon takes a look at this great American polymath. A lot of things were happening during that time. There is uncertainty about France and Britain, not to mention all the work that Thomas Jefferson did as a scholar and a statesman. And so we continue to look towards the examples of the past to highlight the present time as well. And so we do have a Q&A mic that you can use for any questions you may have. Just be sure to speak up onto it. And then please join me in welcoming Jon to Google. So thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. I just realized I am going back in time, so that's sort of troubling. My next J president could either be, I guess, Andrew Johnson or Lyndon Johnson. I'm running out of them as topics, but I'm delighted to be here. Jefferson would have loved Google. He would have loved the whole idea of it. It would have absolutely appealed to both his love of adventure and discovery and also his love of control. In the sense of being able to manage masses of information. And so I think this is a fitting place to talk about him. I want to talk about his intellectual work and how that informed his political work, because he didn't see the two as different. He saw them as contiguous regions with a very porous border. And in the sense that we have lost the sense, the feeling that politics is informed by the life of the mind. I think in the popular conversation, they're seen as very different things. There's politics, and then there's culture and intellectual work, reason, depending on what state you're in, is a different thing. And so I want to talk about what both these things meant to him, how they're connected, and then a couple of thoughts about what we can learn about him. It's almost impossible, except here, to explain how exciting Jefferson's world was to him. He was the first political generation of people trying to create an experiment in self-government after the Enlightenment, after Gutenberg, after princely and priestly authority had both given way at that point. They didn't know, we know how we know how the story turned out, they didn't. So in the sense that he came of age in the late 18th century, a student of Enlightenment ideas, both the Scottish Enlightenment and the European Enlightenment. He was very lucky in having a professor at William and Mary in Williamsburg, which, as you all may know, is the alma mater of Jon Stewart. And so when I mentioned to Jon that they were co-alumni, Jon, in his inimitable way, said, "Was he baked as often as I was?" So, and the answer is no, just in case you're keeping score at home. But he had a teacher named William Small, who was from Scotland and totally got the Enlightenment force, the idea of the scientific revolution. Jefferson overlapped with him for only 2 years, very fortuitous 2 years. And so he comes blazing out of the 1760s. He was born in 1743. He comes blazing out, believing that this is a whole new era in human affairs. We always believe that it's a whole new era in human affairs. It's just we're not always right. He was right, and we're in the midst of one too, because what's going on here and around the world in terms of a digital world is as significant and as creatively disruptive as Gutenberg. We haven't worked out what it all means yet, but what's happening, I think, is of a scale with what happened to make Jefferson's world possible. And so what fell to Jefferson was to try to manage the political implications of this incredibly disruptive experience. For century upon century upon century, priests and kings had held authority, and individuals were to take their orders, salute, and move on. Jefferson, Hamilton, Adams, Washington, Madison, Franklin, that generation of Americans was the first to really be able to engage in an experiment in self-government. And this is where they're connected, and I think it's so important. Jefferson didn't believe that the republic could survive unless we were reasonable creatures and we cared somewhat about each other. We didn't have to love each other. It wasn't a kumbaya kind of thing. But it was, we did have to have a sense that your fate and my fate are somehow linked. Because if we don't have that sense, then there's very little likelihood we will give up the mutual concessions of opinion that we need to make a republic work. And if we don't give up those mutual concessions of opinion to make a republic work, then we better hope the king we get, or the hereditary aristocracy we get, agrees with us all the time, because that's the only alternative. Without sociability, which is the fancy word for saying this, I was in L.A. the other night and did a conversation with Bill Maher at the L.A. Library. He was late just because he was at choir practice, because of his ferocious religious beliefs. But I started a sentence saying, well, historiographically, and he said, don't ever say that again, as an adverb, whatever you do. But in terms of sociability and cultural connection, Jefferson believed that citizenship, more than leadership really, that citizenship was the highest virtue in a republic, because a republic was only as good as its citizens. And it seems sort of banal to say it that way, but the experience of Rome suggests that it's not banal, that it actually is very hard to make these things work. And it required constant attention, constant cultivation, constant nurturing of social ties and the life of the mind in terms of putting reason in the place of revelation. Because without our being able to think for ourselves, we were going to fall back into superstition and absolutism. And that was Jefferson's great terror. I argue that we can't really understand the American Revolution and the early Republic if we don't see the conflict with Great Britain between 1763 and the end of the French and Indian War and the end of the War of 1812 as a 50-year war with Britain. Sometimes hot, sometimes cold, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, but it was a defining drama. And it's as though, without seeing that, I believe, and without trying to feel the things they felt with this possibility that Britain would come back, which, I mean, they barely lost the first time, so there was quite a good reason to think this. Without understanding that, it's like trying to understand Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and George H.W. Bush without reference to the Soviet Union. It's just an overarching fact of their lives that, because of the way we think historically sometimes, we simplify the storyline for obvious necessary narrative reasons. But for them, it was messy and it was scary. And Jefferson lived in mortal fear of this loss of the American experiment. He and John Adams in particular really saw the American Revolution almost as a child of theirs. It sounds very odd that they would have a child together, I guess, but it was an organic, living thing. They had given birth to it, they'd nurtured it, it was in an unruly adolescence. You can play with this metaphor all afternoon. Now we're aged and bent, whatever you want to do. But it was a living thing. They were in constant conversation with it, what it meant. They disagreed fundamentally about the direction it should take, but they respected each other's principles, even if they disagreed about each other's opinions. And that was, I think, what the thinking behind Jefferson's first inaugural, in which he says, every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We're all Federalists, we're all Republicans. And it was a plea for not a bipartisan Valhalla, where you wouldn't pursue it as hard as you could, the political vision you believed in, but you did acknowledge that the warriors on the field, or the gladiators in the arena, were all men, and they were men at this point, men of principle who were trying to preserve the existence and perpetuate the life of the Republic. there was not as much as what we've seen in the last 20 years or so in the United States of hardcore political bases that wanted to delegitimize the winner of an election, which we've seen from 1992 all the way through, was something that would have been quite foreign and quite disturbing to Jefferson, because he understood that men of goodwill could, would, and should disagree, but they should not question each other's patriotism and motives. This is not to say that this was a wonderfully placid era. You know, the American founding sometimes, I fear, is a little bit like a historical antidepressant. You know, we don't like what's going on now, so we read about the founding and we feel slightly better about the country. Partisanship has been an intrinsic element of the American experience. And so if we remember Jefferson, the life of the mind, culture mattered, reason mattered, sociability mattered, all for politics, then let's move to the political side. So that's where Jefferson is in terms of the life of the mind. The life of politics was always going to be contentious and always going to be frustrating. And when I would start in 1790, and you got to love a life where you can say those words in that order. 1790, Jefferson comes back from France. He becomes the first Secretary of State. He and Alexander Hamilton go at each other's throats. And they are daily pitted, as he put it, daily pitted in the cabinet like two cocks, just fighting. And Washington was tired of this. And he wrote a letter to both men saying how unfortunate it is that while we are surrounded on all sides by insidious friends and avowed enemies, that we should be riven by internal dissensions that are harrowing and tearing our vitals. It's a un Washington phrase, A, because it's memorable. There's one thing. He had many virtues. Eloquence was not one of them. But it was a sense, he really believed that their arguments were going to spill over and wreck the whole thing. This is how well it worked. Jefferson wrote back about Hamilton, the illegitimate child of Nevis, saying that I will not suffer the slanders of a man whose history, from the moment at which history can stoop to notice him, is a tissue of machinations against the liberty of the very country that has not only taken him in and given him bread, but heaped its honors upon his head. So it was not a successful intervention for Washington. Hamilton said that Jefferson was a fanatic in politics and an atheist in religion, and an anonymous letter writer wrote to Jefferson, "You ought to get a damn kicking, you redheaded son of a bitch." So this has been going on a while. The question becomes, how do you manage partisanship? How do you marshal it and not let it become so corrosive that the whole cart tips over? Jefferson saw it as a historical phenomenon. He said that men have been divided into parties over differences of opinion of whether the interests of the many or the interests of the few should predominate since those questions convulsed Greece and Rome. So he was going all the way back and thinking all the way through. So what was his solution for this? It's a combination, in my mind, of compromise and citizenship. On the compromise point, short of abandoning the life of the nation, Jefferson would compromise any principle. The great example being 1803, when the Louisiana Purchase becomes a possibility. He learns about it on the 2nd or 3rd of July, realizes that immediately they were going to have to go to the country and get a constitutional amendment to authorize doubling the size of the country. That wasn't in the enumerated powers. And he drafts the amendment. We get to about August 21st, so 6-7 weeks later, and Jefferson gets another letter saying that Napoleon's rethinking this deal. And suddenly, in what I think of as Jefferson's Claude Rains moment, he's shocked to find out that anyone would think we needed a constitutional amendment. He totally dumps that idea, expands the executive office in ways that his head would have exploded if Washington or Hamilton or Adams had done this. But like a lot of small government people, he was perfectly fine with big government as long as he was in charge of it. I'm sure there are no examples of that in our own lives at all, where expedience becomes central. So he compromised, he cut the deals, because he believed that politics was ever unfolding. And that's the idea of citizenship that I think is so important, and what he really, a key part of the legacy. He said that men are not participators in politics only at elections, but every day. And that if one participates every day, then they would rather have, as he put it, their heart ripped out of their bodies than submit to a Bonaparte or a Caesar. So the sense that we should all be politically engaged, we should all be following this, we should all be participating in the larger story of governance, is a very Jeffersonian idea. And it argues for a kind of compromise and a sense of forbearance among citizens that has been lost, I think, to some extent. One of our problems now is a kind of sclerosis in Washington, but it's a sclerosis that is derived from the fact that the bases of each party believe that any compromise with the other side is a total capitulation. And because of the means of communication, you can have congressmen reading Twitter feeds, and that is a sign of the apocalypse, I think, because if you're going to be that hooked into what everyone thinks, then you have very little chance to form your own judgment and to form a reasoned judgment if you're going to be a cat on a hot tin roof to that extent. So I think that's an important element of what we've lost in recent years because of the technology. All the benefits, obviously, is that it makes everyone's voice and the ability to participate, to be a participator, ever more easy, ever more real. And that's absolutely essential. But it needs to have some element of forbearance in it, or it becomes a case where you have two armed camps that are quite well fortified and nobody in the middle. Jefferson's belief in the virtues of compromise were not such that the middle way was always the right way. I'm not arguing that compromise is a virtue in and of itself. Sometimes the deal you get is a deal you don't want. The American experience with civil rights and race is the great example where the middle way was not the right way. There was a right and there was a wrong, and we should have been stronger and more dedicated to pursuing the right earlier and more assiduously. But 6 times out of 10, 7 times out of 10, the practical constraints of history suggest that taking the deal that you have at that moment and then working on it later is the way to go. Jefferson said, the ground of liberty is gained by inches. So for all of the sweeping rhetoric, for all of the sage of Monticello, for all of the great achievements on the tombstone, the author of the Declaration of Independence, of the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, and the founder of the University of Virginia, all those things about the life of the mind and equality and liberty of conscience, all of that is part of the Jefferson legacy. But it's also one of the great acts of misdirection, because it sends us in the opposite direction of his political career and what that teaches us. I think it was quite on purpose. I think he was quite conscious that he wanted us to talk about his ideas and not what he had done for 40 years, because what he did for 40 years was going to be more controversial, and it was going to make him look like a Paul. And the last thing he wanted to look like was a Paul, even though he was one. And so I think one of the reasons I wanted to do the book was to try to recover the politician whom Jefferson himself tried to hide. You know, he hides in plain sight on so many things. And his political career is one of the great examples, and slavery, which we'll talk about in a second. Understanding his political skill and the fact that he was irresistibly drawn to the work of politics when he could have done almost anything. This was a man who, if you had to get a hand dealt to you in the last 300 years, being a rich white Virginian in the middle of the 18th century is pretty damn good. That's not a bad way to start. And you own people. They're dedicated to doing whatever you say. You can borrow endless money from England, and no one apparently ever calls you on it. Jefferson was one of these aristocrats. It was like Winston Churchill. Never had any money, and yet always had terrific champagne at dinner. I don't understand how this works. I can't get that deal, but they did. He had every opportunity to retire to Monticello, to be a man of science, to be a philosopher, to be an author. Irresistibly, he was drawn again and again back to the political arena. And I think that's a good thing. Until we find another way to work these things out, which is not on the horizon, we need people who are willing to suffer the slings and arrows of our own anxieties and our own unhappinesses with politicians to go into the arena to build something. And he clearly saw that this was a moment in human history, both because of the Enlightenment and because of the Revolution being what I think of as an embodiment of the Enlightenment in many ways, was a unique historical moment to create something that would then be subject to the perennial forces and perennial shortcomings of human experience. Very conscious about all those elements of it. And he was the one figure, in my view, at the founding period who did justice to both sides of that equation. There were great politicians and there were great thinkers. Jefferson, with the possible exception of Benjamin Franklin, was the one who straddled those two worlds and brought them together in a way that tangibly changed the course of the world. The idea that individual destiny should be controlled by an individual was a raw, new, untested idea. And Jefferson articulated it as an ideal and fought to make it real. And for that, he's repays our attention, I think. The great hypocrisy and the great failing of his life was his inability, his self-imposed inability to apply these formidable political skills to doing anything about slavery after 1784. Jefferson's born in 43. He's elected to the House of Burgesses in 1769, to the Continental Congress in 1775. He stays in the Confederation Congress in the 1780s. On 4 or 5 occasions through those years, he tried to reform slavery, and he was defeated publicly and decisively each time. And there are two things politicians hate more than any other, and that's being defeated publicly and decisively. And in 1784, he drafted a Northwest ordinance that would have prohibited the spread of slavery west. Sound familiar? It lost by a single vote in the Confederation Congress. A delegate from New Jersey was late. And Jefferson said that in that moment, heaven itself was suffered an awful silence, and the fate of millions yet unborn hung in the balance. Very eloquent, very charming, much like all of Jefferson. Yet, he continued to be a public figure. He was the Secretary of State, the Vice President, and the President of the United States, and the senior statesman in the United States for the next 40 years. And for those 40 years, he never returned to the task of emancipation or colonization, any kind of reform of slavery. My view is that it's because he simply could not imagine a world without it. His first memory was of being a child on a pillow being handed up to a slave on horseback to be taken on a family journey. One of the last things that we know that happened to him is he was in his alcove bed in Monticello and was uncomfortable and was trying to signal to his white family what to do to fix it. And no one understood except an enslaved butler who moved the pillow and made him instantly comfortable. So from the beginning to the end of his life, his life was suffused and made possible by slavery. It's the central hypocrisy, it's the central tragedy of his life. Someone like me can't have it both ways and say he was a master politician, and from 1800 to 1840, for 36 of those years, either Thomas Jefferson himself or a self-described Jeffersonian was president. You can't salute that political experience and that political achievement and not hold him to account for failing to apply those skills to slavery. He clearly knew it was a moral wrong. His letters clearly show it. And yet he just tied himself into ever smaller knots about it because he did not believe that his generation could solve it. It was a very un-Jeffersonian thing to do, to give up hope. In every other sphere of American life, he was the architect of a politics of optimism that every great American leader has drawn on to achieve power and to govern. Lincoln, Roosevelt, Kennedy, Johnson, Reagan, all of those figures talked about the price of present pain and sacrifice being of use to make a better world for tomorrow, and that was the American destiny and the American way. It may sound homiletic, it may sound simple-minded, but it has been an incredibly important central factor in moving the cause of reform forward throughout 2.5 centuries now of American life. So Jefferson is not indicted, he's convicted before the bar of history on slavery. One thing I would urge us all to think about is that, as Arthur Schlesinger used to say, self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap. So our wagging our finger at the past might make us feel better for a moment, but to my mind, the moral utility of history is to look back and realize that if one generation's accepted practice was another generation's clear evil, then we are probably in the midst of a very similar drama right now. So what is the issue, the moral issue of our time, or issues, plural, of our time that 20, 30, 40 years from now, someone is going to look back and say, what were they thinking? What were they doing? To my mind, on a personal level, it's climate change. A compelling moral case has been made largely for economic and cultural reasons of convenience. We've declined to do anything about it, which is kind of what Jefferson was doing with slavery. So using the failures of the past to try to raise our own moral antenna, I think, is one way of making something out of those failures and those shortcomings. And I always learn more from sinners than from saints anyway. So I want to give Abraham Lincoln the last word because he had such a good box office last week. Man. Harry Truman once said that heroes always know when to die. Getting killed on Good Friday, if your name is Abraham, was really smart stagecraft. That was good. Here's what Lincoln said about Jefferson in 1859, about that all men are created equal. He said, "All honor to Jefferson, to the man who in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth, applicable to all men and at all times, that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and stumbling block to the very signs of reappearing tyranny and oppression." Not a bad legacy. Thanks very much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
With the fiscal cliff looming, I'm curious if you'd like to talk about Jefferson's view on debt and deficits, taxes, and how his position may have helped or hurt him during his presidency.
Oh, it's a great question. He was he thought, when he became president, he thought there were too many taxes and too many judges, and he wanted to get rid of both. And did a pretty good job on the judges front, and did a pretty good job on abolishing internal taxes. It did not leave the Treasury in a very good place as the War of 1812 came along, so it was not a brilliant public policy moment. But like a lot of presidents, he overreacted to the excesses of his predecessor. So believing that Adams and Washington had taken the country too far in a federalist direction, he proceeded to take it too far in a Republican direction. The answer being somewhere in the middle. He abhorred public debt because he believed that that was the way to create does this sound familiar to anyone? Create a financial class of people who would speculate without creating anything and devise financial instruments and a culture of what was called stock jobbing at the time. a culture of stock jobbing that would possibly weaken the country by weakening its economy and its potential national security. That turned out to be fairly prescient, as it turned out. This level of debt, none of those guys could get their brains around it. So we can't rip them out of context in any event. I think the lesson of Jefferson for this moment is to take what you can get as quickly as possible if you're the president. One thing that's really important, I think, is a second-term president has one clock and everybody else in the system has another. And a second-term president's clock is ticking toward history. Everybody else's clock is ticking toward the next election. So every other stakeholder in the system has a reason to look at what's politically palatable except the president, who can actually take a long view for the first time. Because second-term presidents have all fought their last election, which I think gives them, I think one of the reasons second terms often feature some stumbles are presidents take that second-term victory as a vindication. It's very clear when you talk to former presidents, nobody knows how to keep score better than former presidents. I mean, they know who the one-termers are and the second-term. It's very, very competitive. Surprise, surprise. But I think that if the president doesn't keep in mind that this clock is ticking fast and his political capital is diminishing by the day, I'm trying to ban this phrase, kicking the can down the road. How many cans can we kick? It's a terrible, we use it too much now. But anything that delays the full reckoning weakens his ultimate position. And so if I were advising the president, I would say, take Boehner by the scruff of the neck right now and try to get what you can in the lame duck session, because it ends fast. Yes, sir.
I'm intrigued by the subtitle or the tagline on the book, The Art of Power. Excuse me.
We did it for search optimization.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm wondering if you could share...
Not many places where you can make a search optimization joke.
Nor where people will laugh.
Sorry.
So intrigued by this notion of the art of power,
yeah.
And wondering if you can share an anecdote about Jefferson's application of power as applied to statecraft and how that might be different than predecessors or successors.
Yeah, I think Louisiana is the great example because my definition of the art of power is that the greatest leaders can articulate an ideal and inspire people to want to pursue it, but can also bring that ideal as close to reality as possible. And that most people can do one or the other. And the great politicians are the ones that can do both. And that's why there are so few, because they're two very different skill sets. Painting a picture of what we should be is a job for people who are eloquent and far-seeing and somewhat detached from reality, because it helps to be, in an intellectual offsite in order to overcome your own limitations and envision a future. Politicians who are just deal makers are just the guys who know how to get a bill through markup. I can't remember what markup is, but legislative mechanics are also highly tactical, pragmatic guys. It's the two who can do it. And Franklin Roosevelt's the great modern example, I think. President Clinton is too, in some ways. There's something poetic that his middle name is Jefferson in the whole sweep of things. But what he did in Louisiana is, and we forget how big a deal this was, by adding Louisiana to the United States, it transformed the country politically and culturally instantly. New England knew this because New England immediately drew up articles of secession because they realized they were going to be outnumbered and it wasn't going to be pretty with the South and the West. And so there was opposition to this. There was a sense that, wait a minute, if we do this, it's going to be transform us more quickly than we're ready for. And by the way, Mr. President, Mr. Republican, you don't have the power to do it. And he just swept all that away, grabbed the initiative and did it when he found out Napoleon was rethinking it. And I'm convinced, because I'm a biographer, that the roots of that decision lay back in his failed wartime governorship of Virginia. He was governor for 2 years during a time of British invasion. He failed to call out the militia in time to repel Benedict Arnold and General Cornwallis. The British almost captured him. He was about 5 minutes ahead of them at Monticello. Could easily have ended up in the Tower facing treason charges if they'd caught him. And he was censured for it. He was attacked for it forever. To the end of his days, he was seen as a coward. The flight from Monticello, it was called. What would they have had him do? That's my question. But he decided then, in what I think of as his Scarlett O'Hara moment, that he'd never be hungry again, that he was never going to be caught flat-footed again. And so Louisiana became the great moment, the great political moment for that. The Declaration itself is an example. The embargo is an example. They're all the way through his political life. But I think that's the most vivid one.
Hello. In the beginning of your remarks, you made a call to action to each of us to get involved politically each day.
Right.
So I wanted to relay personal experience this week, again, talking about the fiscal cliff, where I have some thoughts on policy. And I called in to my congresswomen and to my representative. And basically the pattern was the same in each of these three cases. Hello, basically hello, blah, blah, blah. I asked to speak to the legislative aide dealing with tax and budget issues. They put me on hold for a few moments. They come back. They say, well, can you tell me which group you're calling from? And I say, well, I'm a voter. I'm a constituent.
America.
As if, that's like embarrassing, right? I knew that was the wrong answer, right? And so then they go away for a longer period of time and they come back. Well, the legislative aide is not in the office or busy or et cetera. Can I take your remarks? And then I, try to give my remarks, but they're not really up to speed on, what's going on with legislation, blah, blah, blah. So this is not something that's just happened this week. It's happened repeatedly.
Sure.
Whenever I call in. If I write in to my senators or congresswomen, I get back a few months later a letter that has me wondering what issue it was that I originally wrote about 4 months ago.
Right.
And if I had the same exact opinion, opposite opinion as what I had, I could read that letter and still feel the same exact way about what their response was. In other words, there's no value in it whatsoever.
Right.
So it seems. The question is, how do we get involved in democracy in a daily way that has an impact? Because as I see it, it's really more about TV. It's more about propaganda. It is, and it is about these big groups.
Yeah.
And money. But I'm wondering how people in this room get involved.
Well,
and make a difference.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. All yours.
No, I totally get it, and it makes the fact that you get a letter 4 months later is better than I would have thought. So that's a good sign in some ways. I think it does come down to an organizational principle. The idea that one person can call, and make an impact is, as you've run into it. The practical obstacles to that are seemingly insuperable. So it puts us into a question of, all right, so we need to organize ourselves into groups, into what Burke called little platoons. And then we do that, and then the groups, because of the nature of the groups, become more reflexive, because the people who are going to be running the groups are going to be very devoted, right? They're not going to be kind of volunteering just for, they're going to be thinking about all this stuff. So then do those groups then become part of the base that becomes reflexive and becomes part of the problem? I totally acknowledge that organic chain, and I think that is inevitable. I do think that there are the means of organization in terms of political pressure to put on representatives is such that there are two kinds, right? There's the money and the big corporations, and then there's the rest of us. And the rest of us have to fight with the same means that the corporations do insofar as we can, and that's organizationally. And so clearly, President Obama understands this. The Obama campaign, I should say, understands this. If the stories about their technological capacities, which you all would know much more about than I do, if the stories about their ability to find voters who are inclined to be with them, if they can't figure out a way to use that technology to turn that into a useful army of folks to email, to call, whatever it is, because they do keep, I will say this, your Congresswoman, who is it, by the way?
NSU.
Okay. I was hoping it was the speaker, because that'd be fun. They will get a count at the end of the day about calls pro and con. That's absolutely, quantifiable. But I think it has to be organizational, and I think that it's kind of vital, and otherwise it's going to be totally run by the other. And so at least we should all try to become the other along the way. Does that make sense?
I agree with your setup and your view. It's what I struggle with is I don't see any path from your remarks and where we are now to basically get to where we have an impact. So if I think that, for example, on fiscal cliff, that we should raise taxes the 39.6, do
right.
exactly what Obama ran on, which he seems now to be, moving away from maybe, and not this idea that we give up all the tax
right.
deductions. Where's my group for that?
Well, I think you could. I would imagine that emailing and applying pressure to the House, which is what we're supposed to do, would have an impact. I mean, I think it's going to happen. So if that's what you really believe, well done. I think it's going to happen. I mean, I don't know. I'm not Ralph Nader, so I don't know. Thank God for everyone, including Ralph Nader. Yeah. So I don't really have an action plan for that. But I do think that if we don't keep thinking about this and talking about it, we're going to be in a worse place. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
If you come up with an
I'll do
idea,
it. You're the
write
man.
another book.
I'm going to call you.
Yeah, thank you.
Wait a minute, you're the Google guy. You're supposed to do this. What are you talking to me about? Jesus. I still kill trees for what I do.
So I've always been fascinated by the Declaration of Independence, in particular.
A good thing to be fascinated by.
In particular, a section at the end where Jefferson writes, and I'm paraphrasing, when a government no longer represents the interests of its people, it's their right and it's their duty to overthrow it. Yeah. And that's always struck me as a pretty remarkable thing, the part where it's your duty as a citizen to overthrow a government. Yeah. I'm curious if he ever expounded upon that in his later writings or political philosophies.
That's a great question. One of the issues about writing 22,000 letters eloquently over 80 years is that you come down on almost every side of every issue. It's like the Bible and Winston Churchill. You can quote them on both sides too. He had these flights of revolutionary, lowercase r, revolutionary rhetoric, particularly when he was in France. And then again, there was a big surge of it during the period when he was trying to protest the Alien and Sedition Acts in the late 1790s, in what he called the Reign of Witches. And so there are documents from both those periods where that's where the lines about the tree of liberty requires the blood of tyrants and patriots, it is its natural manure, all those kinds of quotations that both right-wing extremists and left-wing extremists have used in past years to justify certain courses of action. They date from these two periods. So he definitely believed that, because he was doing it right at that moment, that there was an inherent right of revolution. Raises an interesting question about, was there an inherent right of secession? According to his Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which he and Madison wrote, that was an intellectual path to nullification and secession, which honestly, I think, is a case that can be made. The great triumph of Jackson during nullification and ultimately Lincoln and Daniel Webster, was creating this case for union that really flew in the face of the actual strict letter of those documents. And I think it's one of the great political achievements of all time. I think, and thank God they did. But Jefferson's devotion to the idea that institutions had to be reformed, institutions, if they weren't reformable, needed to be overthrown, was a consistent one.
Thanks.
Thanks.
There's a lengthy and often combative sort of historiography around Thomas Jefferson. A lot has been written about him,
There is? I was misinformed.
Sure you ultimately know. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about sort of where your perception falls on the line of that sort of historiographical background.
Sure. What I wanted to do was recover the political Jefferson. My sense is that, particularly in the last 20 years, he has been seen as either a hopeless hypocrite, as opposed to just a hypocrite, in terms of race, or a fundamentally duplicitous politician who had no real principles. And the former is very much, it's quite self-evident in the historiography, as you say. The latter is more subtle, but all too real, I think. We've been in this golden era of great biographies about the people around Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, Adams, and necessarily those books have spent more time on Jefferson's flaws than his virtues for various understandable narrative reasons. And I thought that left a place to have a conversation about Jefferson as politician as opposed to duplicitous politician, insofar as that's redundant. So that's an issue. But I think the critical thing for me was, could I present a compelling portrait of what this man did every day for 40 years? Because he didn't want us looking at this too hard. I mean, I'm convinced that's why the tombstone is the way it is. He understood history. He understood fame. The 18th century sense of fame was really reputation. He knew we'd be talking about him. He and Adams exchanged 158 letters in his retirement. And if you think those are the first draft of those letters, I mean, they're Ciceronian. And I just don't think they were dashing them off. Hey, LOL. That just wasn't. You hear that one about Hamilton? LOL. I also like to point out that my guy didn't get shot in Jersey. Let's keep that in mind, too. So historiographically, I hope that this is Jefferson the politician and a man whose failings are universal in many ways to the nation. Because Jefferson's tragedy is also America's tragedy. One final thing on this. James Parton, who was the first, Henry Randall was really the first biographer, and then James Parton was the second, 1860s or so, 1880s. And Parton wrote that if America is right, then Jefferson is right. If America's wrong, then Jefferson's wrong. That is one hell of a burden to put on any one person. No one says that about Washington. No one says it about Hamilton. No one says it about Adams. No one says it about Madison. But we do say it about Jefferson. And why is that? I think it's because he's such a vivid human figure to us still. He's the one founder I can imagine having a drink with. I can't imagine having a drink with John Adams. I mean, it'd be fine. But I really think that Jefferson lives on in our imaginations because we intuitively know that he articulated the promise of the best we could be, but was far from it. And I think when we're being honest with ourselves, we're all kind of like that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
When you think about our role as citizens today and confronting, the political challenges that we face now, how do you see digital technology helping or hurting that? And is there something that
there's going to be a new plan in a few days?
Yeah.
Right here.
Is there something that we should be building?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, is there a public square beyond the inadvertent one that the internet creates? Is there some place where digital democracy can contribute to the good as opposed to what I think it tends to do now, which is reinforce pre-existing biases? I'm speaking in vastly oversimplified terms, but one of the things that the digital revolution has made possible is you can get in contact. You can make yourself heard anyway, whether it's in comment sections or Twitter or Facebook, whatever it is. Every man is a pundit now, and that's great. But with power comes responsibility, and so simply scream, as FDR once said, simply screaming from the rooftops doesn't help us a whole lot. So is there a way to harness this amazing tool to create a more, what one would argue could be a more constructive political dialogue? I would hope so. And I think we're not even halfway through this, right? I mean, these are the first moments of this. And so I think you all, I don't mean to preach at you, but you all have a hell of a responsibility here. I mean, this is Google. I mean, last night I asked some guy last night in Seattle asked me where he could find a particular letter of Jefferson's, and I thought he meant the idea. No, he meant the letter, the actual one he'd written. And so I said, well, I don't have the date off the top of my head. He said, well, do I have to Google it? I said, well, if you have to ask, then yes, you do. That's a key thing. So you're a verb, so you're one of the key cultural landmarks of the age. So I think that there's an enormous responsibility there to try to figure out how do you use this immense sea, how do you channel it into productive ways. So I should be asking you all this, is my point.
Real quick, so Jefferson's hypocrisy and his Machiavellian tendencies very well documented. Is there any sense in the letters with Adams, any time later in his life, taking stock of his political career, any point at which he says, wow, looking back, I really maybe went a little bit too far at times. I regret some of my actions. I'm sorry, John, for all the backstabbing. Any sort of kind of taking stock and realizing, there are some things I would have done differently?
Yes, but. I think the resumption of the correspondence in 1814, 1815 is in fact that. It's as close as Thomas Jefferson was ever going to get to saying, I'm sorry. And I don't know if you've ever tried to make a politician apologize, but it doesn't work out very well. Y'all know the story of the reunion very quickly, because it's like high school. Benjamin Rush, the Patriot physician from Philadelphia, tells Adams, he's been trying to broker this and get them back together for years. And so he tells Adams that Jefferson's really desperate to go out with you. And he tells Jefferson that, well, man, Adams really wants to ask you out, And so finally, somebody writes somebody. So that was a very careful dance. And I think that the resumption of that correspondence was a sign that the passions of the 1790s in particular, which is where most of this happened, were receding. Adams always tried to introduce the kinds of questions you're asking about, tried to refight a lot of those political battles. Jefferson resisted it. He said we should not be like Priam and buckle on the armor of party once again. And so that was his sense of closing the door. He mused in very interesting ways about the nature of politics. The line I quoted earlier, I think, men have separated themselves into parties over differences of opinion between the interests of the many and the interests of the few. That was a later insight. But it was more implicit. And I would leave you with this. I think the fact that he wrote an epitaph for himself that fails to allude to what he did for 40 years is a sign that he understood that this was always going to be a contentious topic. And politics is always going to be that. And so I hope, one of the reasons I do this is I hope by pointing to the past and pointing out that things have been pretty tough before, that it kind of lowers our collective blood pressure a bit. And I think if our blood pressure is a little lower, I think we make slightly better decisions. So thank you all very much.